Okay. But first, a brief note. I want to mention to everyone that the panels today will be recorded and uploaded afterwards by request of people that weren't able to make it today. All of the presenters have been informed of this and have consented, but if you're a presenter and change your mind, please let me know as soon as possible so I can stop the recording for your part of the panel. I initially discovered Stirner in some dark recess of the internet years ago. I somewhat accidentally rediscovered him about 2 years ago when I was working on my undergraduate thesis on particularity. I immediately saw Stirner as the thinker taking particularity the most seriously by placing it in a central position in his thought. I ended up reading The Unique in Its Property and Stirner's Critics twice that year and wrote my whole thesis just on his work. At that point, his profound influence over my way of thinking became obvious to me, which any of the other grad students here in attendance can attest to. When I first accepted my offer to study here, I became aware that there was another graduate student interested in Stirner. Then when I arrived here last fall, I realized there was a third student, one of my cohorts, also interested in Stirner. I believe this officially made Duquesne the place with the highest concentration of academic Stirnerians in the world. I had already organized a couple conferences in my undergrad, so with that experience, I realized I was getting a sign from the universe that I needed to make this conference happen. I then spoke with the head of our department, who was and has been very enthusiastic about this event, and the rest is history. Not to speak with one voice for all the presenters today, but I think we are all here with our interest in Stirner because we see something unique in his work. I think the one common thing that we all recognize in him is a fundamental radical potential, one which disrupts the established discourse of philosophy. Stirner suddenly reveals that which has been excluded and marginalized from that discourse, which that discourse tries to forget or repress. He shatters the dominant way of thinking by questioning deeply held assumptions of his time in such a way that we, following in his wake, can take those fragments and construct something unique and new with them. The tragedy of Stirner is that he's been forgotten in philosophy, pushed to the margins of our discourse, only really retaining prominence in the anarchist movement. We are all here to, in our own egoistic ways, push against that trend and insist that we must show his value. I think the ultimate aim of this conference can be boiled down to the assertion that Stirner may not be right about everything, and his thought may lack the completeness of others' work. But regardless of all of that, all of his flaws, there's something present in him that is in no one else. And for that reason, he's interesting and worthwhile to talk about. This conference was a one-man operation on the administrative level, but of course I could try to organize things all I want, but nothing would have taken shape like it has without people agreeing to participate and people willing to support and lend their resources to it. So I want to take this moment before going over how today's going to go to thank some people who have been vital in this process. Firstly, I want to thank all of the presenters for agreeing to present. The conference literally would not have been possible if you didn't, so thank you. I also want to thank Dan Seltzer, the head of Duquesne's philosophy department, for agreeing to sponsor this event. Your support's been instrumental in allowing me to make this event what it is, and I greatly appreciate your enthusiasm for it along the way. Likewise, I want to thank the Duquesne philosophy faculty and graduate students present for lending your support in this process. Hearing your excitement and talking about this event was a major motivation in this endeavor. Finally, I want to thank those who volunteered to help moderate the panels today, especially those who heard about this event, either from myself or others, and who reached out to ask how they can make this happen. Each of you make my job today much easier, and I know that your unique perspectives on this topic will add so much to each panel. Now onto the conference itself. You should all have access to the schedule either by email or through the registration page. Each panel will be 1 hour long. Each presentation will be 20 to 22 minutes. And after both presentations, the panel will have a 15-minute Q&A. There will be a 10-minute break between each panel. I've broken the conference up into 3 different sessions: morning, afternoon, and keynote. The morning session will have 3 panels, then a 1 hour lunch break. The afternoon session will have 2 panels, followed by a 1 hour lunch break. Followed by a 1 hour break, not for lunch. After that break, the keynote session will start, which has 1 hour allocated for the keynote address, followed by 1 hour for questions. I also wanted to mention that as of this morning, we have 100 people registered for this event, which is just mind-blowing to me. I would not have expected we'd get that many people interested in an academic conference on Stirner so quickly. So thank you to everyone who's signed up for this. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to the moderator for our first panel, Lillian, to start the day off.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this first session of the first annual Stirner Symposium. My name is Lilian Matrican. I'm a graduate student, former student, graduate master in philosophy from Paris. I've worked on Stirner, among other things, and also post-anarchist epistemology and ethics. So today we will have the first panel of the day on the ontology in Stirner. We will have two speakers. Just to remind you of some of the rules, we will have both presentation that will last for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we will have some questions from the audience that can take place at the end of both presentation. So you can, if you have any question, you can either raise your hands through chat or just type it in the chat and I will read it aloud to the presenters. So just to introduce both our presenters, we have to begin with Adam Jones, who is a PhD researcher at Kingston University, and who will talk to us about the theory of their Einzige, Stirner, Bataille, and anarchist abnormality. And then it will be on Carl Nelson's turn to talk about politics is ontology and the positivity of the unique. And to remind you, so Carl Nelson is a master student at Duquesne University. So I hand it to you, Adam, for this first talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for Cal for putting this together, and look forward to the rest of the day, but let's just kick things off. So the history of Stirner's reception by philosophers is a history of dialectical archaeology. Philosophers, myself included, in aiming to provide an account of Stirner's thought, dig below the surface of his textual corpus in order to posit implicit connections which have been unearthed as philosophical commitments and allegiances. Is Stirner Hegelian? Is he a nominalist? Is he a proto-Marxist? And so on and so forth. These are various meanings that such an archaeology can and often has posited beneath the surface of Stirner's text as implicit, and almost all usually circulate around one text, the Einzige und sein Eigentum. Their function is the same, to present Stirner as a thinker with an arche, a principle, a commanding architecture in which his thought is subservient to a philosopher as an explanatory ground. We do not philosophize with Stirner without philosophizing him through someone else, or at least that is the habit. We do not believe him when he claims that he has based his affair upon nothing in the refrain that consolidates the whole domain of the book by being its opening and closing proclamation. Stirner, for the philosopher, must be brought to heel. The Einzige must serve a discourse which commands the text and an image of thought which commands said discourse. It must have a cause that is identifiable beyond Stirner's own in order to be a cause for us, for philosophers. Stirner himself laments this in the Philosophical Reactionaries, and he says, I am unique, but that is not what you really want. You do not want me to be a real man. You do not give a penny for my uniqueness. You want me to be a man, as you have constructed him, as an ideal for all. You want to make the loutish principle of equality the standard of my life. Principle around principle, demand around demand. In our philosophical and archaeological operations upon Stirner, we approach him in a manner akin to his own theory of property. I mean this in the sense that we use him to empower ourselves. We consume our own selves in the mode of practicing philosophy upon him, which is but one use of a finite life upon this earth. We do not grant him the externality of a thing. We grant him no independence. He exists for our own consumption in philosophical archaeological discourse. It is in such activity that we are closest to Stirner's own operation, and yet equally distant from it. For example, my own work was previously centered on the absolute certainty that the Einzige is that fabled missing piece for the completion of the Hegelian system of philosophy, as its greatest anarchic self-revelation, also referenced in such texts as the work of Lawrence Stepelevich. Empowering my own mission, in which I consumed myself and found great pleasure in consuming Stirner, was the use of him for such a philosophical operation. One chapter of such a project was in the translation of Stirner's view of property onto Hegel's philosophy of right. Stirner was to be made to serve Hegel, as if Hegel was the grand archon, as if he was what Stirner really meant when he described the base of his work as nothing. Stirner, in such Hegelian readings of him, is always implicitly a Hegelian, and so he must be shown to take a Hegelian view of things as property also, as definitely shown in the work of Stepelevich. This would be the case were it not for the fact that Stirner refuses any idea of property as the ownership of things. I quote, "But my property is not a thing, as this has an existence independent of me. Only my power, Macht, is my own." Stirner rejects that property is the ownership of things, and he rejects with this the very basis of abstract right, which conditions any discourse of objective Geist or spirit. Owning is nothing, no thing, other than to be empowered to expropriate, and it is indeed the powers of expropriation and the enjoyment of some flux of sense in the world which may loosely be called a property thereof. As philosophers, we often struggle to fully accept Stirner's refusal of the fixed idea, and indeed of philosophy itself as that which may also be read as axiom, principle, Standpoint, in the German Grundsatz, Prinzip, Standpunkt, and the like. Stirnerian philosophy and we as Stirnerian philosophers therefore empower ourselves in our self-identification as such by demanding that Stirner identify himself. He refuses, and so we must identify him in order to identify ourselves through him. Through the arche, through the command, the beginning, the principal structure of philosophy, we make him both a thing and we make him an empowerment of our practice. This is because, as Guerry and Deleuze so aptly noted, identity is in effect a relation to anonymity. Only the unknown, the undifferentiated, the anonymous have need of a name and number. That anyone at all, whoever it may be unknown and therefore threatening, is the reality, the universe of the one who guards property taken in the bourgeois sense. The first philosophical attempt to dig under the surface of Stirner was Feuerbach himself. For Feuerbach, Stirner could not be a creative nothing in the guise of a human being, nameable only as unnameable, i.e. as the uniqueness of which he identifies the singularity of his non-identity. Stirner writes Stirner's critics purely in defense of the unique, because it is his greatest refusal. It is non-thetic rather than antithetic. In response to this, we often try to get behind him for a Grund or reason, as opposed to finding a deeper nothing, a deaf anarchy, behind our attempts to grasp and contain this very refusal. Feuerbach's response to Stirner aims to get under his skin, into his skull even. When Feuerbach points out the idea of the gendered brain underlying all of this uniqueness, which would bring him into a kind of essential community of the principles of masculinity. Stirner, once again, in Stirner's critic, refuses, not by only rejecting the category, but by exceeding and escaping it. Now, it is in this somewhat polemical spirit that I offer a theory of the unique or uniqueness. That is not in any strict sense a philosophical discovery of any kind of true meaning or hidden allegiance between Stirner and any given philosophy or philosophers, in the sense that it won't be a Hegelian unique, a Foucauldian unique, and so on and so forth. The responses of philosophers and of philosophy to Stirner, even as early as Stirner's critics, was to assert a problematic of uniqueness as a problem of philosophical identification rather than the refusal of identification as such. Stirner frustrates philosophy at the same time as he provides an infinitely problematizable resource for it by refusing to identify himself. As Stirner once wrote again under the moniker of G. Edwards in the Philosophical Reactionaries, the unique laughs in the face of critique when it tries to force him to solve a problem which he has not himself posited. And he has not posited himself as a problem for himself that requires an account based on sound philosophical principles or inherited beginnings. I therefore argue that to provide a theory of the Einzige, of the unique, as opposed to a purely philosophical account of it, one needs to describe its gesture and function as a refusal of philosophy, or at least as a mode of practice as he would have known it, colored as it was by Hegelian philosophical anthropology and identity thinking. To do so, I believe that it is fundamentally illuminating to locate an isomorphic gesture in history of philosophy itself that rejects the philosophical. And I believe there's no better example of attempt to escape from philosophical anthropology and Hegelianism more generally than that of Bataille, from his flight from idealism and above all the Hegelian philosophical anthropology he received from Alexander Kojève. The gesture of Bataille, some would argue to be isomorphic in its gesture of refusal to the unique, is his invocation of the idea of base matter. Stirner is not a Bataillean, fundamentally. I'm not placing under the command of Bataille, but rather they are comrades seeking similar weapons for the same end of escaping powers whose structure is immediately translatable in its form and philosophical function. Bataille's definition of base matter exemplifies such resonances in its description of its function when he describes base matter as being external and foreign to ideal human aspirations. It refuses to allow itself to be reduced to the great ontological machines resulting from these aspirations, disconcerting the human spirit and idealism before something base, to the extent that one recognizes the helplessness of superior principles. What is ideal or philosophical as principle is helpless for Bataille because, as Benjamin Noyes explains, the logic of base materialism is that whatever is elevated or ideal is actually dependent on base matter, and that this dependence means that the purity of the ideal is contaminated. The dependence of the ideal or elevated, brackets the high, on base matter, the low, and the contamination this produces is systematically denied by the ideal, which splits off base matter as whatever is disgusting, vile, subhuman, etc. In this way, it hopes to keep base matter in its place as the base. But this splitting off can never be completely successful because base matter is at the basis of the ideal and of these higher values. This is the same purity of thought and elevation which Stirner rejects in the philosophers of his day. Stirner invokes the unique against the mode of thought that argues that, to quote Stirner, you just have to relate to yourself philosophically or critically, otherwise you are coarse, raw, an accidental or particular subject. He is affirming the basis of the whole ideal, which is constantly escaping it and is for itself before it is for the gaze of the philosopher. The unique does not therefore wish to produce itself before philosophical speculation in the manner of Fichte towards a higher I which it ought to be as an infinite task of actualization. The function of the unique is to produce an unsettling point that not only resists subcapture, but is the very ground of that which is captured and stratified by hierarchy. Stirner explicitly states that he writes about inhumanity, or the profane baseness of the actual human person, not because he wishes to take their side in affirmation of lowness against the mere higher, as if this higher truly was its both higher aspect and its creator, but he sides with the lowness of the unique precisely on the basis that it precedes all such distinctions into the higher and lower. We can see this when Stirner talks about the base and the guise of the inhuman. To quote Stirner, while Stirner writes against the human being, at the same time and in the same breath, he writes against the inhuman monster, as opposed to the human being. But he doesn't write against the human being who is an inhuman monster or the inhuman monster who is a human being. I.e., he writes for the utterly common unique, who is a human being for himself anyhow, because he is an inhuman monster. The uniqueness of Max Stirner is not exclusive to himself. Rather, one's uniqueness is exclusive to everyone and for everyone. It is not reducible to an exchange value, as it is therefore inexchangeable, for as Stirner says, it is not possible to determine a universal valuation of my uniqueness, close quote. Although it nonetheless is exhaustible due to the base fact of death. Similarly, Bataille characterizes the insubordinate character of base matter, which is its non-logical difference, a difference which serves to destabilize its logical and discursive confinements rather than stabilizing them. As Noyes notes, Bataille posits matter as itself being difference, and base matter is purely a functional notion invoking the active flux of instability that ruins the closure of any discourse. This non-logical difference is isomorphic with the function of Stirner invoking the unique. That, to quote Stirner, just as the conceptual world fades away, when one uses the empty name, the name is the empty name to which only the view can give content. The unique doesn't say anything because it is merely a name. My uniqueness is thus my singular non-philosophical baseness. My materiality is my non-logical difference, which exceeds such classifications as inhumanity, which invert the order of creation at the same time as the world becomes polarized into higher and lower ideals. The gesture of Stirner's unique is not philosophical, I argue, but political. It is a revolt against philosophy on behalf of its dark ground and finite other, an embodiment that precedes command and identification. It is the condition of possibility of the very conditions of possibility having their seat in my cognition. Yet it does not exist for these conditions as that which is presupposed for their benefit as universal forms of experience. The base matter of the uniqueness of a body consists not in its hierarchic abnormality, but its anarchic abnormality, which hierarchy can only treat discursively as a negation of the ideal which is to be corrected or negated, destroyed outright. We can clearly see this when he makes the move when Stirner makes the move of identifying both the clinical and the punitive forms of power. His critique of Wilhelm Weitling and the characterization of criminality as a remedial social disease. Quote Stirner here, Weitling has to continue with remedies against the natural remainder of human diseases and weaknesses, and remedies always announce at the start that one considers individuals to be called to a certain well-being, and will consequently treat them in accordance with this human calling. The remedy or cure is only the reverse side of punishment. The theory of cure runs parallel with the theory of punishment. If the latter sees in action a sin against right, the former takes it for a sin against himself. Crime is treated implacably, disease with loving kindness, compassion, and the like. Stirner here is rejecting one of the main innovations of 19th century European criminological anthropology. As Michel Foucault notes in Abnormal, the development of psychiatric power in Europe, France in particular, was shaped by the principle that political movements held a correspondent to healthy or unhealthy physiological characteristics or physiognomies. With Lombroso's study of the supposedly high rates of serious physical defects amongst captured anarchists. As the anarchist philosopher of disability Will Conway articulates, in abnormality, there is a thread that runs through to the political assertion of anarchy, and in anarchy, there is a thread that runs through to a medico-juridical assertion of abnormality. Weitling here in Stirner's work stands as a figure posited on the side of this discursive and medical reduction. He sees the ground of the anarchic body in categories corresponding to the truths of the body's abnormality. However, it is through the base materiality of my unique body, which through its inherent impurity to normal as the essential, is already in revolt by its very existence. That Stirner rejects the judgments of crime and disease as two sides of the same coin, the matter of which is the anarchy of the that Stirner rejects the judgments of crimes in two sides of the same coin shows that he's trying to collapse the distinction here between normal and abnormal into a contest between the anarchic base versus the hierarchical normalization. The anarchy of the body is everywhere in Stirner, and we even find this in the figure of the child in the opening parts of his A Human Life section, whose first fight is against the command and discipline of the parents, who seek to discipline its body, and has in part one of Die Einzige und seine Ergänzung, and eventually has a kind of idealist fanaticism beaten into them by the outside world. Anarchy and abnormality are most keenly linked in Stirner's own time with ideals of high maturity as an ideal of obedience. For example, Edouard Seguin's The Moral Treatment, Hygiene, and Education of Idiots and Other Backward Children was only published a little over a year later in 1846. Which, as Conway reminds us, speaks to the abnormality of the child as possessing a certain anarchic form of will. The normal, desirable adult will is a will that can obey. The will of the so-called idiot is one which anarchically and stubbornly says no. Seguin's recommendation is that teachers should intervene in such a way that produces a total physical capture which serves to subject and master the body. Therefore, the anarchic unique is the abnormality which refuses capture under command for the sake of its own finite life. Here it cannot be ignored that after his death, the anarchy of Stirner's Einzige became itself the object of a medical pathologization by Ernst Schultz in 1903, as emblematic of a typical paranoiac insanity, as is traditional from the example of Seguin just given. That Stirner as the unique exists to be pathologized and philosophized stems from his obstinate refusal to say anything other than no to demands of identification and normalization, i.e., he refuses to essentialize himself before an ideal which he ought to realize in himself. Therefore, I argue that the unique cannot simply be mapped onto an ontology which identifies regions of beings as subjects or moments of universal individuality. It is rather the territory that resists the surveillance of philosophical and anthropological cartography. And if we were going to looking for a gesture of this refusal, Bataille's flight from Hegel in the mode of base matter is an interesting way to find a solidarity with this gesture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam Jones. It was very clear and very interesting. And I believe the second talk we will have from Carl Nelson probably will trigger some reactions from you. So we'll move on to the same subject on ontology Stirner with Carl Nelson, who is, I repeat, a master student at Duquesne University, and who is going to talk to us about politics is ontology and the positivity of the unique. I guess we'll see what Adam Jones could say, because I believe you had like a more negative approach to ontology from Stirner. I leave it to you, Cal.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I'm very curious to see what Adam will have to say about my paper afterwards. But yeah, no, so to give a little bit of context, so this paper is in some ways responding to my own positions on Stirner from about a year ago when I was doing my undergraduate thesis, where I tried to combine Stirner and Lacan. And that led to me holding basically Stirner's views on language to be much more kind of stronger on that Lacanian front, and I think reduced the unique in unhelpful ways. So I'm kind of responding to myself there, but also I was mainly going to do this by connecting Stirner with Deleuze and difference and repetition. But I found that as I was writing that out, I had to do a lot of work to justify like kind of the positions that I was saying Stirner was holding that couldn't really fit in something less than like an article length. So I figured that I would just separate it out and just write about the Stirner. So that's what this is. So I'm kind of intending this as trying to push Stirner a bit closer towards Deleuze in some ways. But on to the actual paper itself, enough of editorializing. So yes, the title is Politics is Ontology, the Positivity of the Unique. Whenever I read Stirner, there's a short list of passages that presents challenges for the orthodox interpretation of him, insofar as we can say there exists an orthodox interpretation of Stirner. The passages I will talk about today, as I argue, prompt a rethinking of four things. One, the negativity of the unique. Two, the ontological status of the unique and of property. Three, the role of the social/political in egoism. And four, how the unique operates in time. Through this rethinking, I hope to demonstrate that by taking the non-conceptual excessive nature of the unique to its limit, we can see how Stirner's egoist ethics or mode of living is a form of ontological investigation into the individual self-development of the unique. The first of these problematic passages lies in Stirner's critics. It's important to mention that language plays an interesting role in Stirner's corpus. In his main work, The Unique and Its Property, he mentions language every once in a while, but never really gives it a central focus. However, when writing anonymously in response to critiques of his work, and in doing so, shedding aside many of the characters and rhetorical tricks he obfuscated his main points with, language suddenly plays a central role in his accounts of the unique. Quote, Stirner names the unique and says at the same time that names don't name it. He utters a name when he names the unique and adds that the unique is only a name. What Stirner says is a word, a thought, a concept. What he means is neither a word, nor a thought, nor a concept. What he says is not the meaning, and what he means cannot be said, unquote. Here we see Stirner say that this central animating concept in his work is actually nothing more than a linguistic remnant. It's an empty word which gestures towards the unnameable real content he's referring to. The unique as a name has no content, it's meaningless, but as a gesture, it has an object that it's gesturing towards. Thus, he draws a subtle distinction between the name unique and that unspeakable content he means by that name. From here on, I'll refer to this unspeakable object of the gesture as the unique, and sometimes the unique as a being or the unique proper, and I'll specify when referring to the unique as a name with no content. The unique as a name is much like the pronoun I. It lacks any content in itself and only ever has content in relation to its speaker. Stirner always speaks in first-person pronouns to make the same point. The unique is always actually my unique, my I. This referencing or gesturing reveals a linguistically meaningless ground to language. As a name, it is a hole or lack within language that allows it to exist and function properly. As a being, it is radically different from all others and all identities as a collection of a being's non-identities. Quote, now I don't think of myself as anything special, but as unique. Without a doubt, I am similar to others. However, this holds good only for comparison or reflection. In fact, I am incomparable, unique. My flesh is not their flesh, my mind is not their mind. If you bring them under generalities, flesh, mind, those are your thoughts, which have nothing to do with my flesh, my mind, and can least of all put out a call to what is mine, unquote. In this quotation, we can see both the different non-identical dimension of the unique, as well as the seeds of what will allow us to make this division between being and the abstract. Upholding this distinction between the unique as an abstract, empty manifestation within language and the unique as a being beyond language is vital, because otherwise we risk absolutizing language for Stirner. By holding to the position that the unique is essentially this empty negativity, fundamentally, and thus by establishing all positivity as that which can exist within language, we ignore the gesture of the unique as a name beyond language, and thus we're applying a stronger position on language than he holds. We might still be inclined towards the stronger view of language within Stirner by reducing this gesture beyond language to a kind of interruption or hiccup within language, a kind of real kernel within language. However, I'm going to next show that he explicitly wants to have room for a non-conceptual development of the unique, totally beyond the bounds of the abstract, which renders this strong view of language and the abstract dead in the water. Now I'll address the issue of interpreting the unique as a being, which can be approached for study. The main issue with this claim is that Stirner seemingly rejects a study of the being of the unique. Quote, there is no conceptual development of the unique. One cannot build a philosophical system with it as a principle, the way one can with being, with thought, with the I. Rather, it puts an end to all conceptual development. The unique is a concept that lacks determination and cannot be made determinate by other concepts or receive a nearer content. It is not the principle of a series of concepts, but a word or concept that, as word or concept, is not capable of any self-development. The development of the unique is your self-development and my self-development, an utterly unique development, because your development is not at all my development, unquote. This appears at first glance to be quite a damning critique of any ontological reading of the unique. And I'll admit at this point, the language of being in ontology is flawed for the reason that it imports a whole conceptual schema and content into the discussion. What I really mean when I speak of the unique as a being is rather the unique as a non-conceptual positivity, as a thing out there. But after distinguishing the unique as a being and the unique as a name, we can read this section in a new light. In referring to the limitations of conceptual development and the potential priority of the unique as the basis of a philosophical system, he is clearly referring to the unique as a name rather than the unique proper, because the unique proper has no existence within the conceptual world of language. This only means that due to the fact that the unique as a name only exists in this conceptually empty gesture towards the unique as a being, it cannot have a conceptual development nor determination. Rather, the unique proper does have a non-conceptual individual self-development, which will be fully explored later in a discussion of its social and political dimension. But it's still worthwhile emphasizing this language of individual/unique self-development necessarily establishes the unique as a positivity against any process of conceptual or abstract determination. There's very explicitly a process of development occurring beyond the bounds of language. The individual development of this non-identical unique is always present, but it ontologically demands a form of ethical comportment towards the world as a mode of conscious egoism, which is a placement of this non-identity in a primary position to the identical in accordance with its ontological priority. These non-identical elements of the unique gives it an independence from the abstract. If these were not present, i.e. if being was perfectly identical, then being could be subsumed within language and abstraction. However, the positivity of the unique, through this mode of conscious egoism, encompasses the totality of our being, including the abstract, not by making our whole being non-identical and thus non-conceptual, but rather by bringing those identical elements of our being into service of the excessive non-identical, by grounding the general abstract in our concrete particularity. Stirner says, quote, here is another fact, that Hess, the critic that he's responding to, is not just a human being, but an utterly unique human being. However, this uniqueness never benefits the human being, because the human being can never become more perfect than it is, unquote. The concept human being excludes the unique and thus is complete or perfect. But the unique therefore can never benefit the human being because from the abstract perspective, they pass like two ships in the night. However, this passage implies a reversal is possible by inhabiting the reverse perspective of the unique as ground of the abstract, in which the concept benefits the unique, which is accomplished by treating the abstract as a tool or fodder for our enjoyment in our engagement with the world. I want to argue that this intentional placement of conscious egoism is simultaneously an ontological move. Insofar as this is an ethic, it simultaneously reveals a certain dimension of being. And this ethical disposition towards the world prompts what I want to refer to as an event. This shift from the ethical comportment to the ontological comportment. This is shown most profoundly in Stirner's discussion of the world in Stirner's Critics. Stirner defines the world as that which, quote, is in relationship to you, exists for you, unquote. Continuing to say, quote, everything turns around you. You are the center of the outer world and of the thought world. Your world extends as far as your capacity, and what you grasp is your own simply because you grasp it. You, the unique, are the unique only together with your property, unquote. Most of this is a necessary consequence of his position, which, to paraphrase, is all that I look upon as my property. This emphasizes that his view of property is not reducible to a purely economic position, but rather his egoism is founded on a pseudo-Hegelian shift from viewing appearance as essential to viewing myself as the essential element, a kind of for us or rather for me shift. But importantly, this last line, that you are only unique together with your property, acts as the first element which allows for a social perspective in his thought. This means that we, as unique, are not disassociable from the relations which constitute our property. Rather, we are only constituted as unique through these relations. In this sense, the unique is the collection of the non-identities of the relations it finds itself in. So far, ownness as the proper relation to the world appears to be merely an individual ethical disposition. However, Stirner makes one final move that turns this relationality into a proper sociality and ontology. He continues to say, quote, meanwhile, it doesn't escape you that what is yours is still itself its own at the same time, i.e., it has its own existence. It is the unique, the same as you. At this point, you forget yourself in sweet self-forgetfulness, unquote. In taking this proper ethical disposition towards the world as intentionally mine, we are able to encounter the uniques, the non-identities of the other. This applies both to objects as well as other subjects. This constitutes a sudden encounter of the non-conceptual non-identities of the world through our own non-conceptual non-identical status, which is what I call the event. This raises a fundamental question. Is this encounter between non-identities mediated by identities, by property? Or is an unmediated unique encounter possible? This last line, at this point you forget yourself in sweet self-forgetfulness, indicates to me that it is an unmediated unique encounter. But we need to turn to a passage from the Uniqueness property where he lays out his views on time and the unique to see precisely why. Stirner gives a revealing description of the unique on the last page of part 1 of the Uniqueness property. For one of the first times in his work, he describes the consumptive destructive process as the central animating aspect of the unique, saying, quote, that I consume myself means only that I am. I do not assume myself because in each moment I am really setting up or creating myself for the first time. And am only I, not by being assumed, but by being set up. And again, set up only in the moment when I set myself up, i.e., I am creator and creature in one, unquote. The I, as unique, does not persist beyond the immediate moment, but instead it must be continually posited every moment before it's consumed and destroyed. The unique is always new, always recreated as new for the first time in every instant. This recreation hints at a repetitive structure underlying the unique as it is temporally expressed, which would be a continual repetition of the new. Likewise, this hints towards a view of time as founded upon the identical and conceptual, which the unique, as non-identical and non-conceptual, continually resists capture by to instead fade away, avoiding being stretched beyond the imminent moment. Meaning that some repetitive positing structure is needed for the unique to have a relation to property beyond the one instant. There's a crucial way in which the unique can't exist in time, if by time we mean the relation of instants with each other in a sequence. This whole perspective conforms to a view which Stirner holds, that the identical is fundamentally built upon an exclusion of the particular, so as to allow for a presence beyond the particular, whether that be across space for multiple of the same objects or across time for the same object at different points in time. Stirner argues here that there's always something radically and fundamentally new in particulars in every instant which cannot be grasped within language and cannot be preserved across instants. Thus, time, as a structure beyond the singular instant, is fundamentally a relation of generalities, and the unique is based upon an atemporal repetition of newness and particularity. Now we can return to the issue of self-forgetfulness. We can see how an ethical approach, which places the unique first and which thus enables encounters with other uniques, necessitates a kind of self-forgetfulness. When one places the unique as primary, we engage in this mode of self-forgetfulness by placing the temporal as that which persists across moments in service to the atemporal. However, we see this self-forgetfulness emerge not through an adoption of a different internal disposition of conscious egoism, but rather through the event, through encountering others as unique. Self-forgetfulness is a social phenomenon, not an individual one. This is why the examples of self-forgetfulness Stirner gives to make his point are fundamentally other-oriented. Quote, when you look into your friend's eyes or reflect upon the joy you would like to bring him, when you gaze up at the stars, meditate upon their laws, or perhaps send them a greeting, which they bring to a lonely little room, when you lose yourself in the activity of the infusion of tiny animals under a microscope, when you rush to help someone in danger of burning or drowning without considering the danger you yourself are risking, then indeed you don't think of yourself, you forget yourself. But do you really exist only when you think of yourself? Do you dissipate when you forget yourself? Do you exist only through self-consciousness? Who doesn't forget himself constantly? Who doesn't lose sight of himself thousands of times in an hour? This self-forgetfulness, this losing of oneself, is for us only a mode of self-enjoyment. It is only the pleasure we take in our world, in our property, i.e. world pleasure, unquote. Here he makes two crucial points. First is a critique of Hegel's dialectical progression by emphasizing egoistic self-forgetting as the fundamental proper social relation. He's critiquing the Hegelian view of the dialectical progression of spirit. For his egoism, social relations are primary to the development of individual self-consciousness. His second point is that this fundamental social relation is a mode of self-enjoyment, which plays a central role in Stirner's egoism. Self-enjoyment is the fundamental mode in which Stirner thinks that we should engage in the world, because to engage in practices which are not based on self-enjoyment requires us to hold those practices as value irrespective of our enjoyment. It alienates ourselves from them by establishing these practices as sacred, as something in which our interests cannot participate, which establishes it as a higher ideal, a phantasm. And then finally, as a brief note, it may seem like he is reinforcing the role of property in this relation against my insistence that this relation is unmediated by property. However, we need to remember that property is simply the only mode of engaging in the world that makes an event possible. Because the other main mode of world engagement, engaging with the world as phantasms, i.e. seeing the ideas in things rather than the things, explicitly denies those others as unique and bars our access to them. This unmediated engagement between uniques can only happen with the backdrop of property, but that does not mean that property intrudes on the engagement. By establishing these social relations as primary and as a mode of self-enjoyment for the egoist, Stirner is making a remarkable point. He establishes these social relations as the individual self-development of the unique. Our unique self-development is our engagement in our world, and to do this egoistically fundamentally means to encounter and engage with other uniques as unique. To make this social/political stance even more radical, through the necessity of self-forgetfulness in this unique encounter, there's a kind of non-conceptual, non-principle-based fidelity to the other as unique, as shown in his quote where he laid out all these examples, like running into a burning building to save someone. So we can understand the non-conceptual individual self-development of the unique as a being or as a positivity as the way in which that unique engages in their social world with others. Thus, for Stirner, this non-conceptual ontology is politics or sociality in the proper egoistic sense, which relies on an event to shift us from this individually egoistic mode to a proper social egoism. Thank you.
Right on time. Thank you very much, Carl. Okay, so now we will move on to the Q&As from the audience. You can type down your questions or raise your hand.
Yeah, you can type them in the Q&A box that you should all have access to, and we'll be able to see them. So.
All right, so I will read the first question from Will Conway. So two critical questions. By inserting an aleatory developmentalism into Stirner's unique and auto-constituting repetitive structure or positivity, do we risk reproducing the founding assumptions of bourgeois subjectivity? And are we not also reproducing dichotomic polarities, particularity versus universality, base matter, or sacred, profane division in Bataille that Stirner would explicitly deny?
I guess
So,
that first part is at least to me with the bourgeois subjectivity. So I would say fundamentally, no, I don't think we risk reproducing that, because the crucial line in my whole paper is that you're unique only together with your property, which makes it rather than kind of constituting you as this kind of like atomistic like individual or this kind of thing that recedes from kind of the world that you or the social relations that you engage within. Rather, you are kind of constituted through those engagements with the world itself, through all of these social relations, the network that you find yourself in, which I think fundamentally is just kind of a much more kind of like a radically like kind of socialist or communist kind of viewpoint rather than some kind of like bourgeois one.
Maybe to complete your answer, so you do keep some sort of subject for you in Stirner, because I believe Adam Jones was talking about Foucault and the subject as subjectification. This is maybe a line that I drew myself, but could you expand maybe on that?
Yeah, so the question is there like a subject in Stirner? So there is, but there's a distinction kind of between like subject and the world, but I think it's constituted in such a way where actually I think what Stirner does with that line that I pointed out is he's kind of trying to abolish the subject-object dichotomy, but in such a way where he's not just kind of doing the phenomenological move where it kind of extends subjectivity out into the world, making like what you encounter kind of part of you. He's kind of bleeding the two together instead. He's preserving a kind of like objectival status almost by kind of co-constituting yourselves. And this is why I kind of pointed out that the unique is fundamentally just the non-identities of the relations that it finds itself in. It's like there is a distinction insofar as there's like an identical and non-identical, which is what property and the unique map onto. But there is still this kind of like deep kind of tie between them that I think really is very important. This is why it isn't just a kind of articulation of a bourgeois subjectivity. And I think this is why he's fundamentally a lot more radical than anything that really has been discussed so far. So
if I could add on to it, actually, I mean, Stirner does have a theory of the subject. It's more in the negative sense of his earlier writing. So you can see a big shift in terms of his break of Hegelianism, particularly as it comes to child psychology. If you see his early papers on schooling and education, even it's a transitionary period around the time of false principle of our education. But by the time of where he talks about subjectivity being formed in the first parts of Die Einzige und seine Agentum, the subject is always formed by subservience, by essentially the disciplining of the child, and then essentially their own attempts to exert themselves, having to develop themselves in a kind of philosophical or maybe somewhat intellectual or mental manner by trying to get around, outsmart the parents, and what do they encounter behind the sensuous rods of like discipline? You encounter the ideal discipline, the logic of the objective spirit, the logic of objective rationality. So the subject is really formed for him when you get turned in, when you get captured by these principles regulate your behavior and sort of reroute desire is a kind of an ideological device towards reproducing the objective ideal of society. When it comes to like a theory of the subject as it would have been understood in Hegelian terms, he's refusing this because in any way, the subject, the unique will speak in this book once or twice, and then when the unique will really speak is when, during the revolution, the proletariat don't need to speak. They just have to, block every port, and there's no need for this because fundamentally, Stirner does not believe you have sort of subjectivity by right of an argument, but by expression of a force, and therefore he doesn't provide a theory of the subject because by what right would it have, insofar as he has rejected the very framework of logical right itself in favor of an insurrectionary power.
All right, thank you very much. So I will move on to another question. I will take the question from Jacob Blumenfeld, whom I can recommend for the audience that maybe not be so familiar with Stirner, his book, All Things Are Nothing to Me. So a question from Mr. Blumenfeld to Adam, coming from Skal's talk. So you choose the base matter concept from Bataille to connect him to Stirner. And I always thought his concept on expenditure, as excess, was very close to Stirner's theory of conception of property and self. What do you think about this, Adam?
I absolutely agree, and in the part of my sort of thesis where I'm writing on this, I specifically use Jakob yours description of consumption to build upon this, because as when Stirner talks about self-enjoyments, self-Genussseins, he talks about the enjoyment of life is using life up. Fundamentally, it does speak to an ethics which can come into an idea of Bataillean sovereignty, a consumption of life without labor. Insofar as for Stirner, we are always sort of laboring to reproduce the dominant objectivity, insofar as our bodily actions, our embodied life, is always directed in favor of reproducing it through fatherland, familial, mandatory familial morality, and so on and so forth. I think they have this particular isomorphism with each other insofar as they are both trying to escape the Hegelian mode of thinking. I mean, the reading of Stirner as a Hegelian, I tried it. Stirner rejects the very principle of young Hegelianism that he formulates in the 1843 because he describes it as autonomy of the spirits. Max Stirner does not use the word autonomy. He uses the word autonomy once in the Einsicht seine Agentum, negatively. Fundamentally, the encounter of the young Hegelians breaks him out of the principle he assigns to them. This is where I think a post-Hegelian Bataillean conception of things would go further on. And just I think me and Cal actually had quite a lot of overlap in terms of, particularly in terms of finding, because what my problem was with a philosophical identification of Stirner is the image of thought under which he is to be identified. And if we're going to go for if we're going to change the image of thought away from the kind of thinking he's rebelling against, then this kind of Deleuzian singular positivity is where we're going to have to go, particularly when it comes to thinking of the unique as a being, but not as a mapped out, pinned down being, but as a positive self-differentiating, a life, to put it in Deleuzian terms.
Right, thank you very much. Do you want to add something on this point, particularly, Cal?
Not particularly. I mean, but to kind of respond to I guess a related question that someone asked, which is what do we actually disagree on? Because sounds like we agree a lot more than we disagree. And I think that's generally true. I think maybe the biggest disagreement might be just the utility of the use of the language of being and ontology. But other than that, I mean, I think that we're drawing on a lot of same passages. I think we're making a lot of the same points. I even actually cut out a section, basically kind of that you included almost at the beginning of yours, talking about how we really can't be trying to approach Stirner as trying to classify him under the thought of others in different ways. I think that we're very close in a lot of ways. So
I think what we're both sort of finding sort of issue with subtly is the history of the ontological, basically particularly analytic ontological readings of Stirner, particularly in the work of someone like John Jenkins, who's done some really interesting work on Stirner, when they read the unique as something like Kantian apperception, this transcendental, detachable site from which Stirner's unique detaches itself from everything and then legislates upon itself, which is an absurd thing because it can't attach itself to anything, but it's detached from the entire world, and it's constantly, as Marx and Engels said, it's a mini police state because it can't commit to anything, because committing is halfway to being, spooked. So I think we're both responding to a particular tendency there.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah.
All right, so we have maybe some time for a bit more question. So we'll take a question from Justine Cowett. So, if the unique can be seen as a purely negative floating signifier, can we think of the unique that go beyond the confinement of individualism? I don't know if you can answer this. Is it clear enough for you?
I think so. I think ultimately, like, that's kind of the thing I'm pushing against, which is that we can't think about it as just like a purely negative floating signifier, because that reduces Stirner's views on language down to everything is subsumed within language, and that which is excessive or resists it is some kind of mechanism internal to language. So if we are stuck within that, then yeah, I don't really think that we can move beyond that kind of crude individualism. But that's why we need to go beyond language. We have to move beyond that kind of picture into the excess, which is what the unique kind of as proper really is.
Yeah, and just to clarify something about sort of egoism, when Stirner says egoistic, the translation of Einzige and ego has been catastrophic for the Anglophone understanding of Stirner. But when he says egoistic, he's fundamentally just affirming, in a way, the negative of what the other young Hegelians are doing. I think we really have to understand this text as a kind of like a bomb being dropped on a conversation, or Feuerbach is yelling at the Stirnerian cat to not push over his glass of water. He's going to do it anyway. So there is a fundamental explosion of the discourse here, because he affirms the egoistic insofar as it is the negative, the particular, the non-Servian aspect of, for example, people like Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach, who you could really describe his philosophy of the anti-individualistic par excellence, with the egoism of being, being the one who discovered this.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe you just answered this one already, but if you want to add anything on Stirner's view of subjectivity and its distinction from Hegel's. So to read the whole question from Nathan Wood, Isakon seems to reflect the master-slave dialectic. It's one of the first passage of the unique in terms of how the subject gains such an identification insofar as the ego can oppose itself to the will of another. Is the unique a social phenomenon or individual phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally the thing I'm trying to do with my paper is show how the unique, as it's kind of like institutionally and kind of like socially constituted as like kind of an individual, breaks down in the proper mode of egoism. So I will agree that like as you kind of go through the progression, like with this child psychology, it's fundamentally based in a kind of opposition with things, with ideas, and then ultimately to recognize yourself as the ground of ideas. It does have that kind of flavor of the master-slave dialectic, and likewise, like kind of through his whole historical progression, conflict and opposition is a very key part of it. But ultimately, I'm arguing that only makes sense in that kind of already like dominating kind of way of viewing things, almost, if we want to use kind of the Nietzschean terms, in like a life denying kind of mode. And I'm trying to emphasize egoism as a kind of life affirming mode, which pushes against that, which starts to unravel those kinds of the way in which you're constituted through opposition, to rather show that like we are kind of foundationally social in the proper mode of egoism, rather than something that we develop into. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah. So to answer the final question, the unique is both, but it is primarily a social phenomenon, and it is constituted as an individual phenomenon.
It doesn't have the hard barrier around it that the term ego sometimes connotates, because
Yes.
it is fundamentally modular, constantly connecting and being empowered by what is around it, even when there is some sort of spooking or piloting, which it captures it in these kind of circuits, which it is constantly trying to labor to reproduce the dominant objectivity through being a good patriot, being a good communist, in the sort of the sense in which he was saying, being a good revolutionary. I mean, in terms of Hegel, so Stirner's, so the first half of Stirner's Die Einzige und seine Agentum is entirely a rip-off of the lectures he attended in 1828, I believe, which is Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of spirit, or Geist. And that also includes mainly the sequence of child development from man, youth, adult, old man. Of course, Stirner says he doesn't write about the old man because you have time for that if he gets old. He didn't. But regarding the disagreement of Hegel thinks that this subservience, this sort of subservience of one's particular thing into universal actually gives you a kind of balance of universal in particular in what he calls maturity, which is in the cultivation of habits, a second nature, where one's particular desires are integrated into the universal, because the fulfillment of your particular desires is driven to being fulfilled in the universal. This is the same ground as his philosophy of right. And his philosophy of right begins in the idea that property is based on the idea that you are expressing particular desires and you submit to a mediating institution in order that your very capacity to own things, your capacity to be a self, is reflected back upon you. You alienate power, is returned back to you, and therefore your particularity is preserved in the universality. Now, Stirner wants to reject this because ultimately the objective world that forces you into this is ultimately one of domination, and is one of constricting things to reproducing the same external logics of the objective world, which ultimately have not been challenged. It is ultimately a rejection of Hegelian ideas of habits through ideas of counter habits. Maybe we can think of something like Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the state as a sort of transcendental habit, and anarchy as a kind of habit that wards off state formations. And we can sort of map that onto Stirner's constant gesture of refusal. Ultimately, yeah, the insurrection speaks for itself. He doesn't really want to speak for it.
All right, thank you very much. So hey, we have a little bit of time. I will allow myself one small question, maybe that can open the discussion also. I think both of you worked a little bit on Deleuze's work. What do you think of his concept of a body without organs? Because I believe there's something like this, like a gesture. Deleuze calls this concept a gesture, and I think maybe the unique, or what we could call the creative nothing, is also a kind of gesture. You talked about it as a tool and as a practice. What are your thoughts on this? Is this something you developed yourself in your works?
I'll let Adam go first if he wants.
Oh,
it seems like you're very excited about this one.
It's very tempting to call the unique a body about organs, because the body about organs is fundamentally disjunctive. It's the idea. I mean, fundamentally, the idea is that any organization of a body into being a part or a functionary aspect of a system of material activity presupposes a virtual potentiality of that body to be something else. You couldn't reorganize a body unless there was a virtuality which exceeds its original kind of, or plasticity, which exceeds its original kind of organization. Now, is this the unique? I mean, functionally, I think there's a potential for it to be a good way of explaining it insofar, but the task really is in distinguishing the image of thought that Stirner's rejecting. Because otherwise, otherwise it might be that there isn't a rejection here.
If I could just precise my question, I'm not going to say is it the same thing or not, but isn't Deleuze maybe describing a bit more precisely what Stirner is tending towards with this? Want to add anything or have a concluding note on the panel?
Well, to reject the organs of organization is also to reject them as alienated properties, I guess. To return, I mean, the original term comes from Anderson and Artaud, who says, when you have made him a body without organs and had delivered him from all of his automatic reactions, you will have returned him to his true freedom. And whilst freedom is a very different sort of concept for Stirner, this idea of rejecting the automatic reactions, or the way in which we have been automated into serving these societal desires or societal constructed systems, which isn't to say they're not real, of course, is very similar, I think, to the gesture that you isolate in the body of our organs.
All right, thank you very much to both of you. So I will just reply to one question. Where can we find both of your works? So to Adam Jones, I think you are the main writer of the Happy Hour at Hipples, which is a website, I guess, on the young Hegelians. Do you have anywhere we can find some of your other works?
Yes, thank you. You can also find the stuff we do. We've done some episodes on Stirner. We actually interviewed Jakob as well, both on the Zero Books YouTube channel, and also I'm one of the co-hosts on the Acid Horizon podcast. So there'll be other Stirnerian and Deleuzian stuff. Also some Hegel there too, for anyone interested.
All right, and Cal, I will ask you the same question.
Yeah, currently I don't have anywhere where I'm kind of uploading my work. I am working
Mhm.
on that though, but I can provide my email address in the chat. And if anyone is interested in kind of getting the paper copy of what I just read out to you, or getting updates on when I actually get the rest of my work out, I can definitely be more than happy to share all of that. So, yeah.
All right, so we're about to conclude this first panel. Thank you very much to both presenters. Do you have any concluding remarks or words you want to add?
Other than, I mean, thank you, Adam, for sharing this panel with me. I think this was a great encounter. You know, it's like when I first kind of saw that we were both kind of writing on very similar topics, I was like, okay, well, we have to put these two papers in conversation with each other. So, yeah.
No, absolute pleasure. Like, thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, looking forward to the rest of the day. Oh, I mean.
Well, thank you very much to everyone in the audience and to our two speakers, of course. So we'll go on to a small 10-minute breaks. Then we'll be moving on to a second panel on revolutionary politics in Stirner with two brilliant speakers as well, Jen Russell and Jacob Blumenfeld. So about one talk, I would say, on desire, probably, and another one on the relationship between Stirner and Marx. Thank you very much to everyone. And this is my last word.
Perfect. Yeah. So like you said, we're going to start a 10-minute break now. So I'm going to turn off my camera and I'll be back in about, actually, no, for the next presenters, go ahead and join through the presenter link. So that way we can make sure your tech setup is working and everything, but everyone else feel free to take a break. So, yeah. Hey. Yes. All right. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to pop right out and use the restroom real quick, and then I'll be back to make sure everyone's setup is working. Hey, Jacob.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. How are you?
Good. Am I going first or second?
Yeah, so I believe Dwayne is going to go first, and the setup's kind of going to be the same as the last panel. So I'll just introduce y'all, and then he'll go for about 20 minutes. You'll go for 20 minutes, and we'll go in Q&A. That'll be pretty straightforward.
You should just cut me off if I go too long or try to give me a warning. I have a PowerPoint. I hope it works.
Okay, you have a PowerPoint. Let me double check that everything is.
I think I could share. Oh, really disabled. Can you enable me to share?
That's a good point. Let's see what I can do. So I see here.
Whoever the host is.
I feel like I should be able to do that somehow. I'll have to ask Cal when he gets back. Let's see here. That's the chat. I don't know if I can.
Whoever's the host, man. So maybe it's.
Yeah, I think Cal might have to. I don't see any like way for me to get into the settings and play around with things.
Okay, I'm back.
Hi, Cal. I think you might have to do this. Can you make it so that Jacob and I guess Dwayne as well can share any like PowerPoints or anything they might have?
Yes, I will make y'all co-hosts, and you should be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do it now. Thanks.
Perfect.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
Hi there. Samantha, Cal, Jacob. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Dwayne. I'm going to